All right, Moose, talking about the Utah football roster, it's drastically different. And Kyle Whittingham, it was great to hear from him, Jason Beck for the first time, and Morgan Scalley in their press conference that they had yesterday. And in that press conference, there's a lot of things we'll have to get to on a future show. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about was how he talked about how Utah went about building this roster. They talked about the NIL priorities, and those were retention was one thing that they really focused on. It was at the top, and then talked about how they kind of looked at each position almost like they used an NFL model to build this roster out. And I do think this is the best way to do it. I think the biggest thing, just like in terms of recruiting, right? You want to recruit your own state. Well, when you got really good players, you want to keep them. So I like that retention was at the top of Utah's offseason list. And then using that NFL model of how do we build our roster? Who do we offer the most NIL money to? How do we look at the guys we want to bring in then too? I do think this is a really smart way that Kyle Whittingham and co have employed building a roster in 2025.
Yeah, so this is kind of my bread and butter. That's what War Room is. It was built on. So we literally go in and we're like, hey, here's your roster. Here's your depth charts. Let's put them online. How much money do you have at this position? How much money do you have at this position? How much money do you have at this position? And you look at it and you're like, is the guy in the portal better than the guys we already have? That's what you have to ask yourself. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, the answer is no. Utah has done a phenomenal job developing guys. But because they've done such a good job developing guys, some of those guys are enticed to hit the portal because they know they're better than at least 80 other teams starting at their position. And so they're like, some of these teams want to pay me a lot of money. And so it's interesting to hear what Witt's doing. And we can see what they've done. You look at the 2025 class. They signed 2 quarterbacks. They signed 2 running backs. They signed 2 receivers, 3 offensive linemen, 5 defensive linemen. They signed 3 linebackers. They signed 5 defensive backs. And then they have like some athletes in there as well. 2 athletes, and then Dylan Curtis, a kicker. So they are still going heavy in the high school realm. Some of these P4 teams, they're signing like 12 high school kids. Utah is going bigger in the high school because their bread and butter is developing and keeping guys in. It's interesting. You talk to different teams. Dan Lanning came out and said that his biggest recruiting at the end of the season is his own team. And you're seeing a lot of teams that they're echoing that sentiment. They're like, we've got to keep our guys and make sure no one else is coming in. Because it's not just, hey, I want the top guys from that team, so I'm a coach and I'm going to call them. No, you're at risk for losing your job. But if one of your boosters calls and offers them something and DMs them on Twitter or whatever, there's opportunities there. That's the crazy thing. And there's nothing the coaches can do to control that either. And so that's what's crazy about college football. There's no processes in place to stop open recruiting.
Yeah.
And that's kind of out of control. And it's tough to see. But yes. I think that most of these teams that are good do a great job keeping their players in-house.
Yeah, and Utah, for the most part, has been able to do that. This was one of the rare years where that hasn't worked out as they would have hoped. So now that we know, retention's the top thing with Utah, and now we know that that's the priority, we can also look at, hey, they use the NFL model to value their positions for where they add guys in the portal. So if we look at what Utah brought in through the portal class, this is how I see Utah viewing their roster building method. Number one, it's clear they still value quarterback above all else. I also want to make this clear. I'm talking about how Utah has chosen to build their roster through the portal. Utah has faith in, and they've done a really good job developing their offensive line. Clearly, they only added 1 offensive lineman through the portal cycle this year. I don't think they added any last year. So they just haven't really touched on the offensive line too much. I think that would be a higher priority in other years. But when you look at the portal cycle this year, felt like quarterback was their top priority. Felt like wide receiver was their second biggest priority. Then I would say cornerback. You could say running back was a higher priority maybe, but I don't know if that was a higher priority in terms of like how Utah builds their roster as much as it was, we have a drastic need at running back because everyone is gone. And obviously they landed Wayshawn Parker, so that was a massive get. And then defensive end, I thought was a priority too. What do you feel like Kyle Whittingham and Utah's roster priorities are, Moose? And do they match up similar to how you would build how you would have your roster positional value board?
So a roster positional value board, it's always interesting. It's number one, what you can get. Mm-hmm. Utah can't sit there and be like, we're going to throw money at a 5-star because that just depletes your NIL. So what can you get within reason and quickly? So if I'm Utah, I'm like, number one, what's our offensive identity want to be? Coach Beck likes to throw the ball. He likes to spread it out, and he likes to be a lot of times in situations where it's not just run the ball down their throats and control the clock like Whittingham has done in the past. This is a different offensive coordinator than Whittingham has ever had. Mm-hmm. And he's had to loosen the controls and let him do what he needs to do. That's why a lot of the running backs hit the portal. That's why some tight ends hit the portal. But it's why it's attracting a lot of receivers as well. So if I'm to put value, I'm going to see who's going to be catching the ball. And I'm going to put a little more value on receiver than I have in running back in the past. I'm going to put a little more value on O-line than I have in the past to make sure my quarterback is healthy, because that is what we've seen from Utah, the number one thing. Healthy quarterback means winning games. When you're down to your fifth string quarterback, no matter how talented they are, they were fifth string for a reason going into the season. And so you're sitting there, you're like, okay, keep the quarterback up, get the ball out, and then get to the quarterback. The way you get to the quarterback, having great coverage and having good pass rush, whether that's from linebacker or D-line, it doesn't matter. Get yourself a great pass rusher to eat at the other team's quarterback. And that's where you start the value, and then you go from there. And then you throw a ton of money, just a truckload, at the kickers.
Mm-hmm. Utah did get a punter in the portal, Moose. They did get a punter.
They did lose a punter too. And I like the punter we lost. I'm like, oh no, that's a bad loss.
I know. Texas can't compete with that NIL money. They're just lucky they beat ASU with some of those missed calls and things like that. But anyways, Moose, I want to talk also now about, so we've talked about how Utah kind of looks at things. I want to see if it matches up to how you and I would do this. So if we're starting, because Utah looks at it from an NFL standpoint. So if you and I were GM, this is what I want to do, talking about how we would kind of build our roster, placing the importance on position. I have my list here, and I'm curious if yours would match up. I have quarterback as the most important position when you're building a roster. Then I would go offensive tackle. Third, I would go defensive end. After that, I would go wide receiver. And honestly, after my top three, I think there's a clear top three, and then it kind of fluctuates for me a little bit. I went wide receiver. Then from there, I went with defensive tackle, interior line, cornerback, linebacker, safety, running back, tight end. I have a clear top three, and then you can kind of shuffle the other ones around. How do you view roster building and positional importance?
So roster building, it always starts with the quarterback. You're absolutely correct in your assessment right there. Your team will go as far as your quarterback will take you. We know that. Then protect the quarterback. Number two, offensive tackle. I don't agree with you at wide receiver, because if you have a good enough quarterback, he'll make the receiving room better. Sure. And if he's upright, that means you have good O-line, good tackles. That means he's got time to find receivers. If you've got a quarterback running for his life, it's just not good. So number three, I actually go for corner, because if you can,
I had D end at 3, like pass rush.
Yeah, I go corner because especially in Utah, because we can find DNs on the street. DNs are a great commodity that we have in Utah. There's a lot of high school kids here that can rush the passer. Okay. We have OFA Academy. We've got great offensive and defensive linemen in this state. Finding elite corners, there's only one Smith Snowden every 3 or 4 years. And so you have to have 2 or 3 of those guys ready to go. Okay. And so for Utah, I'd put a premium on corner for that reason. And then I'd go defensive end. Okay. And then I'd go running back, because those late games in the season, you have to have a running back to grind out those first downs, seal games, and then I'd go receiver.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
It's a little different, I know, but it's hard to put a price on all these guys. And what's interesting is there's a market out there. So if you're a tight end, You're like, this is what the top of the market is. This is what the bottom of the market is. And the market dictates what a player is worth. So top quarterback, we could be looking at 2, 3, 4 million a year. Mm-hmm. But if you were willing to take like a middle tier quarterback, maybe that's $1 million a year. And then you could spread out that wealth all over. So that's where it becomes tough to look at your NIL, what you've got going on, and how much money you have to play with, because you're like, I can land the number 1 tight end in the country for 400,000. Mm-hmm. Is that better than getting the number 5 tackle, or whatever the number is? I'm putting placeholders there.
It's the roster balancing and constructing is crazy right now in the sports. I was ready to jump on you for your, Utah offensive, for the offensive line thing. Cause at first I was like, well, Utah finds corners all the time too. But your point about they're not in the state of Utah develops offensive linemen overall better than and defensive linemen too, better than they do cornerbacks. That I totally agree with when you look at the overall history. There's some really good players, and Utah has consistently brought in good cornerbacks, but it seems the offensive linemen and D linemen usually been a little more frequent than a Smith Snowden. For the outside of him, like the best cornerback to come out of Utah in the past few years. Obviously, there was a safety in Bountiful, who I'm just blanking on his name. He's at BYU now. He was the top player in last year's class.
Falatau Satawala.
Thank you very much. That's who I was thinking of there. So
before that, you'd go like Ike Larson. Like you can find safeties, but corners are very difficult to find in this state. There is one coming up. It's Gennaro Guilford Jr., and I think he's the next best corner to come out. He'll end up being about 6'3", but his dad is on the staff at BYU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this roster building can be so challenging. Also, the player you just mentioned, what year is he?
He is a 27.
Okay, almost a perfect tease. But we are about to talk about the class of 2026 overall group in one moment.